Okay, exciting times. We've just come to where the Concorde is housed here at Duxford, and we're about to witness the nose being dropped, which I have to confess is not something I've ever seen before. I dare say Adam, who's joined me here, air traffic control here, I dare say this is something you've seen quite regularly.
Well, actually, technically, no.
Right.
Because when we would see it coming out of the terminal, taxiing out, it was already dropped. So we never saw it in transition. And then obviously after it took off, it would raise the nose and it would
Just be gone.
It would be gone.
Yeah.
Coming in, it would lower the nose before it joined the final approach. So we would see it with the nose already down, and then it would park. And so not really. So I'm interested to see this as well.
Now, this is not a passenger variant, is it? This was actually a research plane, is that correct?
Yes, this was one of the two British prototype Concorde airframes built. So this one did a lot of the testing, and we've been inside it today, so we've seen a lot of the flight test equipment is still in there. There's no passenger seats, and this one actually, as it says on the side of the aircraft, it went out to Maine in the USA to do cold weather testing as part of the flight test and certification of the aircraft. So it's a very interesting aircraft to go inside.
I bet. Now, I'm sure you don't mind me saying that you've been doing your job long enough to know to sort of sing Concorde obviously in the air. Were there any, because obviously it's supersonic aircraft, it's famous for being that. It's an odd shaped aircraft. I know you have to have different timings and things depending on different aircrafts. How did this particular aircraft, Concorde, coming in to land at Heathrow, how would that differ from, say, any other aircraft?
The main effect on ATC operations at Heathrow was the speed of the aircraft coming into land. It was significantly quicker than any other aircraft we would be controlling. So we had to provide extra separation ahead of it to allow for that speed difference. And I remember once I was controlling, and I had an aircraft to tow across the runway, and with Concorde coming in, and I thought, I've got plenty of room ahead of Concorde, I'll clear this aircraft to start towing across the runway. And it was only when the point was reached where this tower was going to start moving onto the runway, and I thought, no, I think discretion is the better part of valor here.
Absolutely.
I'll tell him to hold position, and thankfully, that was the correct thing to do, because I think I would have been sending Concorde around.
Wow.
To do another approach if I'd continued with that plan.
So when it comes to taking off then, I mean, how would that differ to, say, like an A320 or something? I mean, obviously speed, but I mean, what sort of speed? Presumably it's the same sort of speeds that you get with most aircraft on the runway.
Yes, on the runway, although and a lot noisier.
Yeah.
And in the old control tower, we could certainly almost feel the vibration as well.
Wow.
When it plugged the afterburners in. As soon as it took off, it would just keep accelerating to 300 knots or so. And so we, again, on departure, we had to leave extra time ahead of it because it would be catching up the normal airliners. I know Captain Nick doesn't like me using that phrase when I'm talking about Concorde, but the normal aircraft would be significantly slower than Concorde, so we'd have to provide extra separation ahead of it. But the differences for ATC at Heathrow actually began in time about an hour and a half before the Concorde flight.
Wow.
So what would happen is the flight crew would get on board a lot earlier than, again, a normal flight, maybe up to an hour ahead of the passengers getting on board. They would call us up on the radio and give us a time that they thought they would be ready to depart from the stand. We would then ring through to the control centre, which was at West Drayton in those days, but now at Swanwick, and talk to the control sector that would be controlling high level over the Bristol Channel and over towards Ireland, because we had to effectively block out an area, a three-dimensional volume of airspace for Concorde to climb to supersonic, accelerate through the sound barrier to supersonic and cruise climb up to 60,000 feet. And given the fuel total that they had on board, they really couldn't stop. Once they started climbing, they needed to climb all the way up to cruising level.
Okay.
We couldn't really stop them off from crossing traffic.
Once it started, that was it.
Exactly.
They had
so that's why we would have to reserve this big block of airspace for it. And as part of that, we would say, right, Concorde's going to get everyone here. Then they would work out, okay, we need to reserve this airspace at this time. And then they would work that back to give us a takeoff time that we would try and achieve for it on departure at Heathrow. So we would start planning it from that point. And that's why I think some of the other airline pilots around Heathrow in those days would say that we gave it priority,
right?
Because it wasn't really because it was low on fuel. It was actually because it had a takeoff time it had to achieve to get to this airspace at the appropriate time.
Okay. Otherwise, again, all sorts of things, because it's moving so fast. Essentially.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So now, again, excuse my naivety here. So we're going to hopefully now watch the nose being dropped. This is where my naivety really kicks in. Why does the Concorde have to have a nose that drops?
So basically, it's all about visibility from the cockpit.
Right.
That's the main reason. The aerodynamic, the design of Concorde is such that it doesn't really like flying at low speed.
Okay.
The wing, the fuselage is all designed for supersonic flight. So when it's flying low, the aircraft has to be very nose high to achieve the required amount of lift from the wing. We call it the angle of attack of the wing. So the aircraft is flying along very nose high, whether it's coming into land or even climbing up, but below 300 knots. So to enable the flight crew to see out of the window, the design was the nose would drop down to give them a view ahead and slightly below of the aircraft. So when it was taxiing out and taking off, the nose would drop to 5 degrees down, which was enough to allow the flight crew to taxi around and not go off into the grass. And then when it was coming into land, again even more nose high, it would drop to its full drop of 12.5 degrees. And when it was coming in, that amount of drop wasn't quite enough. So if you actually go into the cockpit of Concorde, there's a cutout above the two pilot seats. They would raise their seat up like you do in the car, up as high as possible, and then their head would be in this sort of cutout in the roof of the cockpit, almost at an angle to enable them to see over the nose.
Wow.
to land the aircraft. So I know there's some videos on YouTube, I think, of cockpit recordings of Concorde coming into land.
Yeah.
But you'll see the pilot, whoever's landing,
They're right
is right up.
Yeah.
Their head is against the top of the cockpit roof. So basically, it was all about visibility from the cockpit.
Right. Okay. I mean, and presumably the shape of the aircraft was essentially so it could achieve these speeds. So it was all about aerodynamics.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's Mach 2 aircraft. It is almost the quintessential paper dart. You fold up a piece of paper to throw a paper airplane. That's almost the shape of Concorde. Just very streamlined, and the control system and the aerodynamics is all geared to be efficient at supersonic speeds. I mean, this can fly supersonic without afterburner, which is where the massive flames are coming out the back of the engines. Whereas still today, most military aircraft still need afterburner to fly supersonic, but Concorde could do it for hours and hours just without it.
Without
yeah.
thing. So this is the I-74. You were saying that this is gathering data. So what data was it gathering during its time?
So specifically, this one, when it went to Maine in the USA, was looking at how the airframe reacted to icing. Okay. So actually, you can see on the leading edge of the left-hand wing, there's black markings with different panels, and they would see how and fly again when they're flying. They would be flying into icing conditions, discovering how the airframe reacted to ice build-up on the wings. And this marking on the front of the wing was being recorded by a camera that's just beneath the door, looking back at the leading edge of the wing, so they could identify which part of the wing would be accreting the ice, just to see how that affected the flying characteristics. And even it's just leave an aircraft out overnight in freezing conditions, come to it the next day and see if they can use it, if the tyres, the hydraulic systems react okay to those cold temperatures. Up at 60,000 feet or so, this airframe, Concorde, has to go through dramatic temperature changes. It could be the friction of the skin would be so much that the airframe would heat up, and I'm sure you've heard and the listeners have heard that Concorde would grow in length by about a foot when it was supersonic, because it would heat up. So there's not this one, but the one at Filton, the Concorde there, which was one of British Airways' regular Concorde aircraft. On its last supersonic flight, there used to be a gap open up in the bulkhead between the cockpit and the passenger cabin. The captain put his captain's cap in that gap, and then when it descended, cooled down, the airframe contracted, so there's still a British Airways captain's cap ensconced in the Concorde airframe that now you cannot get to unless you rip the aircraft apart, because the aircraft contracts when it cools down.
Fantastic. So, I mean, it's a beautiful aircraft. I mean, so many people, when we've interviewed them, saying, you know, whichever aircraft they would love to have a go at flying at, which one would it be? So many people say that. I mean, why do you think it's got such everybody's got such a love for it?
I mean, I don't know. It's just one of those indefinable things, I think.
I mean, presumably from an ATC point of view, it was a bit of a pain in the arse.
Yes, it was. It was.
Because you had to clear so much airspace for it to go about its business safely.
Create more workload than any other single aircraft that we would handle. But again, it was one of those aircraft that really we would all look and watch it take off.
Get so excited.
These very cynical air traffic controllers in Heathrow Tower, you know, they've seen everything. But we would all watch Concorde take off.
Yeah,
and we
absolutely.
would all watch Concorde land. So it was a very special aircraft, and I do regret the fact I never got to fly on it. I always say to people, I was in the cockpit while it was moving, but that was while it was being towed from a hangar to the terminal on the back of it.
That's your claim to fame.
That's my claim to fame.
So, is there an aircraft? I don't think we've ever actually asked you this. Is if you could sort of be on an aircraft that is retired? I mean, would it be Concorde? Would be the ultimate dream for you?
In terms of civilian aircraft, yes, I think so. I mean, you know, just looking at it now, the windows are so small, the fuselage is so cramped compared to most modern airliners now that the actual experience actually probably wouldn't be that nice. I mean, I know they had lovely silver service and you know, exquisite food, but the actual aircraft is actually compromised from a passenger point of view. But just to see that, you know, Mach meter that's on the front of the bulkhead tick over to 2.00.
I mean, it's such an
see the curvature of the Earth and all that would be amazing.
Indeed. Yeah. Well, Adam, thank you very much for your time.
No problem at all. Thank you, Matt.